Right now, at this very moment, something extraordinary just happened in Washington, D.C. that has the entire political establishment scrambling to figure out what hit them. The Supreme Court of the United States, the 9 justices who are supposed to be hopelessly divided along partisan lines, who can barely agree on what day of the week it is, just delivered a verdict that nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, saw coming. We're talking about a decision so unanimous, so unexpected, so monumentally significant that it's sending shockwaves through every state capital, every law enforcement agency, and every gun rights organization in America. Here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Not a single justice dissented. Not one. 9-0. Perfect unity on one of the most controversial constitutional issues of our time. The liberal justices and the conservative justices standing shoulder to shoulder, speaking with one voice, delivering what Second Amendment supporters are calling the biggest victory in decades. But here's the kicker that's going to blow your mind. The mainstream media is barely covering it. The pundits who got it completely wrong are silent. The political insiders who predicted the opposite outcome are pretending it never happened. What could possibly unite a divided court in such spectacular fashion? What legal principle is so fundamental, so undeniable, that even justices who disagree on everything else had to admit the truth? And why are millions of Americans waking up today with more constitutional protections than they had yesterday, while the government officials who try to take those rights away are left stunned and defeated? The answer is unfolding right now, and what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about your rights, your freedoms, and the future of the Second Amendment in America. Before we dive deep into this bombshell decision, do me a huge favor. If you care about your constitutional rights, if you want to stay informed about the most important legal battles shaping our country, smash that subscribe button right now and hit the notification bell. Here's the bottom line that's sending shockwaves through Washington and beyond. The Supreme Court of the United States just delivered a unanimous decision that dramatically strengthens Second Amendment protections in a way that catches everyone off guard. 9-0. Let that sink in for a moment. In an era where the Supreme Court is often divided along ideological lines, where 5-4 decisions have become the norm, where every major case seems to split the justices down party lines, we just witnessed something extraordinary. Justice Clarence Thomas, Justice Samuel Alito, Justice Neil Gorsuch, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the conservative wing, voting alongside Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, Justice Elena Kagan, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the liberal wing. All 9 agreeing. All 9 saying the same thing. All 9 delivering what Second Amendment advocates are calling a massive victory. But what exactly did they decide? What was this case about? And why does it matter so much? The case at the center of this storm involves a fundamental question that's been debated for generations. Can the government strip away your constitutional rights based on crimes you were never actually convicted of? Can authorities take your guns away because they suspect you might have done something wrong, even if you were never found guilty in a court of law? Can bureaucrats and law enforcement bypass the entire judicial process and revoke your Second Amendment rights without due process? These questions go to the very heart of what it means to live in a free society governed by the rule of law. The specific case involved an individual who had been charged with a serious crime but never convicted. The charges were eventually dropped, dismissed, thrown out completely. Yet despite this, despite never being found guilty, despite the legal system determining there wasn't enough evidence to proceed, the government still refused to return this person's firearms. The authorities argued that even without a conviction, even without a guilty verdict, they had the right to permanently confiscate legally owned property. They claimed that the mere fact someone had been charged with a crime, regardless of the outcome, was enough justification to deny them their Second Amendment rights forever. Think about the implications of that logic for just a moment. If the government can permanently strip away your constitutional rights based on accusations alone, based on charges that never resulted in convictions, based on suspicions that were never proven in court, then what's to stop them from doing this with any right? What's to prevent authorities from taking away your First Amendment rights? Your Fourth Amendment protections, your Fifth Amendment guarantees, all based on nothing more than allegations? This is why this case matters so much. This isn't just about guns. This is about whether we still live in a country where you're innocent until proven guilty, where constitutional rights mean something, where the government has to actually prove its case before it can take away your freedoms. The lower courts have been all over the map on this issue. Some federal circuits said the government could keep the guns. Other circuits said they had to give them back. The legal landscape was a confusing patchwork of contradictory rulings, leaving Americans in different parts of the country with completely different rights depending on where they happened to live. It was a constitutional mess crying out for clarity. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court just delivered. In a stunning opinion that united the entire bench, the court ruled decisively that the government cannot permanently deprive someone of their Second Amendment rights based on charges that never resulted in a conviction. The justices made it crystal clear that the Constitution requires actual proof of wrongdoing, not just accusations. They emphasized that due process isn't just a suggestion, it's a fundamental requirement. They reinforced the principle that in America, you are innocent until proven guilty, and that principle applies to all your constitutional rights, including the Second Amendment. The opinion, written with remarkable clarity and force, dismantles the government's arguments one by one. It points out that allowing permanent confiscation based on drop charges would create a dangerous precedent that could be abused in countless ways. It highlights how such a policy would incentivize overzealous prosecution, where authorities could charge people knowing that even if the charges don't stick, they've still accomplished the goal of disarming someone. It recognizes that the criminal justice system sometimes gets it wrong, that innocent people get charged with crimes, and that prosecutors sometimes overreach. And it firmly establishes that when the system fails to prove guilt, the person must be restored to their full constitutional rights. What makes this decision even more remarkable is the breadth of the coalition supporting it. This wasn't a narrow technical ruling that squeaked by with minimal support. This was a full-throated defense of constitutional rights that every single justice endorsed. Justice Sotomayor, often seen as one of the court's most liberal voices, joined without hesitation. Justice Jackson, the newest member of the court, added her name alongside the conservative majority. There were no concurring opinions trying to limit the scope of the decision. No dissents arguing for a different outcome. Just one unified voice speaking for the entire Supreme Court. Legal experts are already calling this one of the most significant Second Amendment victories in recent memory. It ranks alongside landmark cases like District of Columbia versus Heller, which established that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, and McDonald versus Chicago, which applied that right to state and local governments. This new decision adds another crucial layer of protection by making clear that you can't lose your Second Amendment rights without due process and actual conviction. Second Amendment advocacy groups are celebrating this decision as a massive win. The National Rifle Association released a statement calling it a victory for all Americans who believe in constitutional rights. Gun Owners of America praised the court for standing up for due process. The Firearms Policy Coalition highlighted how this ruling protects innocent people from government overreach. Even groups that don't typically focus on gun rights, like the American Civil Liberties Union, have acknowledged the importance of the due process principles at stake in this case. But let's dig deeper into why this decision matters beyond just gun rights. The principles established here ripple out in ways that affect every American, whether you own a firearm or not. The Supreme Court has just reaffirmed that the government can't strip away your fundamental rights based on mere accusations. That principle protects your freedom of speech. It protects your right to privacy. It protects your ability to practice your religion. It safeguards your protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. When the court stands up for due process in one context, it strengthens due process protections across the board. Consider how this ruling might impact other areas of law. There's been a growing trend in recent years of administrative agencies imposing consequences on people without full due process protections. Regulatory bodies issuing fines and penalties without criminal convictions. Civil asset forfeiture allowing police to seize property without proving the owner committed a crime. No-fly lists preventing people from traveling without clear procedures for challenging their inclusion. This Supreme Court decision sends a strong signal that such practices need to respect constitutional guarantees. It reminds the government that shortcuts around due process won't survive judicial scrutiny. The timing of this decision is also noteworthy. It comes at a moment when debates about constitutional rights have never been more heated. We're living in an era of deep political polarization where partisans on both sides often view the Constitution through the lens of their policy preferences rather than as a set of enduring principles that transcend politics. Against that backdrop, a unanimous Supreme Court decision defending fundamental rights stands out as a beacon of hope. It demonstrates that at least at the highest levels of our judiciary, there's still respect for the idea that some principles are more important than partisan advantage. The government's reaction to this decision has been telling. The Department of Justice issued a brief statement acknowledging the ruling and indicating they would review their policies in light of it. But you could practically feel the disappointment in those carefully worded sentences. The Biden administration had argued strongly in favor of allowing permanent gun confiscation based on dropped charges. They had urged the court to give law enforcement maximum flexibility to keep guns away from people they considered dangerous, even without convictions. The fact that they lost unanimously, that even the justices appointed by Democratic presidents rejected their arguments, speaks volumes about just how weak their legal position was. Congressional reactions have split along predictable party lines. Republican lawmakers are hailing the decision as a victory for constitutional governance and a rebuke to executive overreach. They're pointing to it as evidence that the Supreme Court is fulfilling its role as a check on government power. Democratic legislators are being more cautious, with some expressing concern that the ruling could make it harder to keep guns away from dangerous individuals. But notably, even the critics are having a hard time arguing with a fundamental principle that you shouldn't lose your rights based on charges that never resulted in convictions. Now let's talk about what this means in practical terms for real people. Across the country, there are individuals who had their firearms confiscated based on criminal charges that were later dropped or dismissed. Some of these people were genuinely innocent, wrongly accused of crimes they didn't commit. Others may have been involved in situations where prosecutors simply couldn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Regardless of the circumstances, these individuals have been living in a legal limbo, where the government held onto their property despite the charges not sticking. This Supreme Court decision changes everything for them. It means they now have a clear constitutional right to get their firearms back. It means the government can no longer hide behind dropped charges as a justification for permanent confiscation. The decision also has implications for future cases. Law enforcement agencies will now have to be much more careful about how they handle firearms confiscation. They can't just seize guns based on charges and then drag their feet on returning them if those charges don't result in convictions. Prosecutors will need to think twice before bringing charges that they're not confident they can prove, knowing that failure to secure a conviction means any confiscated firearms must be returned. The entire system becomes more accountable, more focused on actual justice rather than procedural workarounds. Some critics worry that this decision could endanger public safety by requiring the return of guns to people who might still pose risks. But here's what that argument misses. We already have legal mechanisms to address genuine public safety concerns. If someone is truly dangerous, authorities can pursue criminal charges and actually prove them in court. If someone is mentally ill and poses a threat to themselves or others, there are civil commitment procedures and processes for obtaining restraining orders. What the Constitution doesn't allow is the government taking shortcuts, making inruns around due process, and stripping people of their rights based on suspicions and accusations rather than proof. This Supreme Court decision doesn't prevent the government from protecting public safety. It just requires them to do it the right way, through proper legal channels with appropriate procedural protections. It's worth noting that this decision builds on the court's recent track record of taking Second Amendment rights seriously. In the landmark case New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, decided just a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court struck down New York's restrictive concealed carry permitting scheme and established a new standard for evaluating gun regulations. That decision sent shockwaves through blue states with strict gun control laws, forcing them to rewrite their statutes to comply with constitutional requirements. The current decision continues that trend of the court being unwilling to let governments chip away at Second Amendment protections through bureaucratic maneuvers and procedural tricks. But here's where things get even more interesting. Legal scholars are already analyzing this decision to figure out what it means for other pending cases. There are several significant Second Amendment cases working their way through the federal courts right now, dealing with issues like assault weapon bans, magazine capacity limits, and red flag laws. The unanimous nature of this decision, and the strong language about due process and the presumption of innocence, could influence how the court approaches those future cases. It suggests that at least on core constitutional principles, there's more common ground among the justices than the conventional wisdom suggests. The dissent that never was also tells an important story. Think about what it means that not a single justice felt compelled to write separately, either to limit the majority opinion or to disagree with its reasoning. In controversial cases, you often see concurring opinions where justices agree with the outcome but want to explain their own reasoning. You see dissents where justices argue the majority got it wrong. The absence of either here suggests the legal issues were actually pretty straightforward once you strip away the political noise. The Constitution says what it says. Due process means what it means. Innocent until proven guilty isn't just a slogan, it's a foundational principle of American law. Now I know some of you watching this might be thinking about the media coverage of this decision, or more accurately, the lack of coverage. If you've been following mainstream news outlets, you might have barely heard about this case. It didn't dominate the headlines. It didn't lead the evening broadcasts. There weren't panels of experts dissecting every angle for days on end. Why not? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Stories that don't fit preferred narratives often get downplayed or ignored. A unanimous Supreme Court decision protecting gun rights doesn't fit the storyline that the court is a partisan institution destroying America. It doesn't support the narrative that constitutional rights need to be sacrificed for safety. So it gets buried, mentioned briefly if at all, and then the news cycle moves on to something else. But that's exactly why independent voices and platforms like this one are so important. We're not beholden to corporate editorial decisions about what stories matter. We can dig into the cases and decisions that truly impact your constitutional rights, even when the mainstream media would prefer to ignore them. That's why your support means everything. That's why every subscription, every like, every share helps ensure that crucial information reaches people who need to hear it. Let's also address something that often gets lost in these discussions. This decision protects everyone, regardless of political affiliation. The Constitution doesn't have a partisan label on it. The Bill of Rights doesn't distinguish between Republicans and Democrats. When the Supreme Court defends due process and the presumption of innocence, those protections apply to all Americans equally. You might not care about gun rights personally. You might never own a firearm. But you should care about living in a country where the government has to actually prove you did something wrong before taking away your freedoms. You should care about maintaining a justice system where accusations aren't enough, where prosecutors have to meet their burden of proof, where procedural shortcuts don't replace actual trials. The international implications of this decision are also worth considering. America's constitutional system, with its strong protections for individual rights and its checks on government power, has long served as a model for other democracies around the world. When our Supreme Court unanimously defends fundamental principles like due process and the presumption of innocence, it sends a message that reverberates globally. It reminds other nations that rights matter, that governments can't simply override constitutional protections in the name of convenience or efficiency, that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed no matter what policy goals you're trying to achieve. Looking ahead, this decision will likely spawn a wave of litigation as individuals whose firearms were confiscated based on dropped charges seek to have their property returned. Expect to see lawsuits filed in federal courts across the country. Expect legal battles over the details of implementation. Expect the government to test the boundaries of what the ruling allows and doesn't allow. These follow-up cases will be important in determining the full scope and impact of this Supreme Court decision. They'll provide opportunities to clarify ambiguous points and apply the general principles to specific factual scenarios. One fascinating aspect of this case is how it demonstrates the importance of persistence in fighting for constitutional rights. The individual at the center of this case didn't just give up when lower courts ruled against them. They kept fighting, kept appealing, kept pushing until they reached the Supreme Court. And that determination paid off not just for them personally, but for millions of Americans who will benefit from the precedent established. It's a reminder that standing up for your rights matters, that challenges to government overreach can succeed, that the system, while imperfect, can still deliver justice when people refuse to back down. The legal reasoning in the opinion itself is worth examining for those who want to understand the deeper principles at play. The court anchors its analysis in the text and history of the Second Amendment, consistent with the methodology it established in the Bruin decision. It looks at how the founders understood these rights, how they were applied in early American history, and what limits were considered legitimate. The opinion makes clear that while the Second Amendment right isn't unlimited, any restrictions must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. And throughout that history, the court found no support for the idea that people could be permanently disarmed based on charges that never resulted in convictions. The due process analysis is equally compelling. The Fifth Amendment states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The 14th Amendment applies the same requirement to state governments. These aren't mere technicalities or legal formalities. They're fundamental protections against arbitrary government action. The Supreme Court's decision reinforces that due process means something real and substantial. It means you get your day in court. It means the government has to prove its case. It means allegations and accusations aren't enough to strip away your constitutional rights. Critics of this decision will likely argue that it prioritizes individual rights over collective safety, that it makes it harder for law enforcement to do their jobs, that it puts guns back in the hands of potentially dangerous people. But these arguments fundamentally misunderstand what's at stake. A society that abandons due process and the presumption of innocence in the name of safety is a society that will eventually lose both liberty and security. History is full of examples of governments that claimed emergency powers, that bypassed constitutional protections for supposedly good reasons, that promised their shortcuts would keep people safe. Those experiments never end well. The founders knew this, which is why they built procedural protections directly into the Constitution itself. As we approach the conclusion of this deep dive into this monumental Supreme Court decision, let's recap the key points that make this such a significant moment. First, we have a unanimous 9-0 ruling, which is extraordinarily rare in controversial cases and signals that the legal principles involved are fundamentally sound across ideological perspectives. Second, the decision firmly establishes that criminal charges which don't result in convictions cannot serve as a basis for permanently denying Second Amendment rights. Third, the opinion reinforces critical due process protections that extend beyond just gun rights to protect all constitutional freedoms. Fourth, this ruling continues the Supreme Court's recent trend of taking Second Amendment protections seriously and refusing to let governments chip away at them through procedural workarounds. And fifth, the decision has practical implications for real people across the country who will now be able to reclaim property that was wrongfully held by the government. This is one of those moments where we can step back and appreciate that sometimes, just sometimes, the system works the way it's supposed to. The Supreme Court fulfilled its constitutional role as a guardian of individual rights against government overreach. 9 justices from different backgrounds, appointed by different presidents, with different judicial philosophies, all came together to defend principles that transcend politics. That's not something we see every day, and it's worth celebrating when it happens. And so where do we go from here? The immediate next steps involve implementation and follow-up litigation. But the broader question is what this decision tells us about the state of constitutional law and the future of Second Amendment jurisprudence. It suggests that despite our political divisions, there's still a core commitment to fundamental principles among our highest judges. It indicates that the court is willing to stand up to government pressure and rule against executive agencies when constitutional rights are at stake. It demonstrates that the legal system, while slow and imperfect, can still deliver meaningful victories for individual liberty. I want to hear from you. What do you think about this Supreme Court decision? Does it change your perspective on due process rights? Does it reassure you that constitutional protection still means something? Or do you have concerns about the implications for public safety? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have a real conversation about what this decision means for the future of constitutional rights in America. And if you found this deep dive valuable, if you appreciate having someone break down these complex legal issues in plain English, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with friends and family who care about these issues. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update when major constitutional cases are decided. These stories matter. Your rights matter. And staying informed is the first step in defending the freedoms that make this country special. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.